I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow.
Welcome everyone to another episode of Mudou de História. It's an episode to be in fully English because I have the honor to receive Ian Worthington. I hope I said that correctly. Welcome, Professor. It's an honor to have you here.
Well, thank you very much. I'm really pleased that you invited me. It's an honor for me as well.
And today I have Ian here to talk about one of the greatest generals of the history, Alexander the Great, or Alexander of Macedon. But before we start talking about Alexander, Ian, can you please introduce yourself a little for my audience?
Well, my name is Ian Worthington. I'm Professor of History at Macquarie University in Sidney, Australia. My work is mostly in Greek history and Greek oratory. I've worked on Alexander the Great, Macedonia, the second for many, many years. And I think that's about all I can tell you about me. I'm married. I've got 2 adult children, both at university and costing me a fortune. Other than that, I'm just a regular guy who visited Brazil in 2019 to attend a rhetoric conference at Hoya Pessoa. But I also was able to visit Rio de Janeiro and Belo Horizonte and give talks there. And I just had a wonderful time, fell in love with the country, fell in love with capoeiras, and can't wait to go back.
I'm happy you like Brazil.
Absolutely.
We have our problems, but it's an amazing country. And I love Belo Horizonte.
Since getting home for every Christmas and birthday, my wife has bought me a bottle of cachaça, and so we can make capoeiras here.
I love cachaça. It's one of my favorite drinks. And as Ian said, he's an expert, if I can say so, in ancient history. So he's the perfect person to talk about Alexander the Great. I was in FMG when he talked a little about Alexander. But before we talk about Alexander, how was Macedonia during the Philip dynasty, if I can say that way?
Yeah, during Philip's reign, it was really Alexander's father, Philip II, that transformed Macedonia. Before Philip came to power, which was in 359 BC, Macedonia was really a backward country. It was on the periphery of the Greek world. It did not have a developed economy. It had a very poor army. It was constantly invaded by tribes that lived on its borders. And basically the place was a mess. And when Philip came along, the Greeks who lived south of Mount Olympus, because in antiquity, Mount Olympus was the dividing line, the barrier, if you like, between Macedonia and Greece. But the Greeks south of Mount Olympus just expected Macedonia to spiral down the toilet. Instead, Philip came to the throne and turned Macedonia around. He introduced economic measures. He created a new army, and then he went on campaign. And gradually, he expanded Macedonia to include what was ancient Thrace, as far east as the Hellespont. He conquered the Greeks, and he was about to launch an invasion of the Persian Empire when he was assassinated. So it was really a case that Philip was the game changer, if you like, in Macedonian history. He made Macedonia a superpower of the ancient world, and that enabled Alexander, his son, to invade Persia and score the successes that he did.
When I was younger, I heard a rumor or a fake news maybe that Philip's murder was set or planned by Alexander. Is that true or just a fake news?
No, fake news. Let's not. That reminds me too much of Donald Trump. Let's not use that phrase. Um, it's conspiracy theory. There are two ancient writers, Diodorus and Justin, who implicate Alexander and his mother Olympias, who was Philip's fourth wife, in a plot to kill Philip. I actually believe that was the case. But another theory is that Philip was murdered by a former lover and member of his bodyguard, a man called Pausanias, who acted for personal reasons. But given that that Philip was about to invade Persia, that Alexander wanted to go with him, but was told, no, you're going to stay behind and look after Macedonia. I think there are enough arguments to be made that Olympias and possibly even Alexander were behind a plot to kill Philip so that Alexander could become king. But I'm just as big a conspiracy theorist as Oliver Stone is.
I think all of us who study history have a little, a little theories that we believe.
Well, that's one of the nice things, because otherwise history would be really boring.
I agree totally with you. And when Philip wanted to invade Persia and was killed, Alexander was, I believe, 18, 19, right?
That's right. He was born in 356. His father was assassinated in 336, so that made him late 19, maybe 20. We don't know exactly the month he was born. Philip was assassinated in summer 336, so Alexander is either 19 or is just turned 20.
So he's a young person, young adult, who is just became king of a powerful empire, a powerful kingdom, to be
Mm-hmm.
precisely. But
That's
was
right.
he? But was he like prepared during his childhood to become a king? I know he was a student of Aristotle, if I'm not mistaken.
That's right. Yeah, Philip hired Aristotle to be the tutor of Alexander, and Aristotle tutored Alexander from about the age of 14 to 16 or so. Alexander was always seems to have been a very clever boy. He was supposed to have read all of Greek literature. He loved Homer. He was supposed to be able to converse with visiting ambassadors at a very high level, even when he was a young boy. So he seems to have been a precocious child. And yes, he was groomed to be king. He was heir to the throne. And in fact, the reason why Philip ended Aristotle teaching him when Alexander hit 16 was because Philip was off to campaign in Thrace. And while he was away, he made Alexander the regent of Macedonia. So he was sort of looking after Macedonia while Dad was away. And while Philip was away, Alexander was faced with a revolt by a tribe called the Medi on the Strymon River. And he actually led an army against them and defeated them. And then he founded a colony there, a little city there, which he named after himself. So this is not very many 16-year-olds do that. I remember that our son, when he was 16, was just deep into video games and could not hold a conversation. He's 24 now and not much different. But Alexander, you see, was brought up to be next in line in the throne, and I think he would have been serious about this too. And we see that. I mean, I can't really comment on other European countries, but certainly in the recent Queen Elizabeth II's Platinum Jubilee, you saw little Prince George there, who looks really serious, and apparently he already knows that however old he is, what is it? I don't know, 8, something like that. He already knows he's going to be a future king. So he's being groomed for the role, and you see that he's really serious compared to his brother and sister in public affairs. I think Alexander's a lot like that. There is a lot There was a lot riding on his shoulders, and he knew he was going to be the next king.
When Philip died, Alexander became the new king. The Macedonians were like, "Oh, that's fine. We trust Alexander," or they were like, "I don't trust this boy a lot."
No, they were fine with it because this is the dynasty by then had been around for a couple of hundred years or more. It was the Argead dynasty, supposed to have been founded in the 7th century, so 200-300 years or so. There's no question that Alexander was going to succeed his father. So although there was some people apparently were not happy that Alexander became king. This was probably a faction at court that was against him. The Macedonians as a whole were okay with that, and that's shown by the fact that there was no revolts by the Macedonians, that they didn't try to overthrow him and establish somebody else on the throne. So unlike his father, who had to struggle when he became king, Alexander had a pretty easy ride. But that's just from the Macedonians, of course. The Greeks south of Mount Olympus revolted from Macedonian rule, and Alexander had to deal with them very quickly.
So we can say that even after Philip's death, Philip still helped his son a little by like stabilizing the country.
Yeah, absolutely. And Philip remained a force in Alexander's life. I mean, one of the things I say in my work is that Alexander was always trying to eclipse, always trying to do better than what his father had done. And we see this in the invasion of Persia. We see this in Alexander walking around saying, by the way, guys, I'm a god. But he could never shake off he could never shake off Philip's shadow. And I actually refer to this as Philip's ghost. I don't know if you've ever read Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, but in that particular play by William Shakespeare, Julius Caesar is assassinated in the second act. And yet the whole thing goes on for 5 acts. Why is it called Julius Caesar? And that's because Caesar's ghost dominates the entire play. And I say that Philip's ghost dominates Alexander's entire life. So he could never get away from his father's reputation, his father's shadow, no matter how hard he tried. And that really got to him psychologically. That explains a lot for many of the things he did.
For example, that explains why he went on rampage, trying to conquer the whole Asia, basically.
I think so, yeah. I mean, I've argued that Philip did not intend to bring down the Persian Empire, that he probably intended only to campaign in what is today Turkey. But Alexander wanted to go further than that. And also, Alexander loved a good fight. Our ancient sources say that he didn't know anything fighting. So he was never going to say one day, okay, come on, men, let's go home. And so I can, switch on the television and watch drama for the rest of my life. That was not Alexander. He was always thirsty for a fight. And of course, that's not what you want in a king. You want someone to conquer, sure, but also to consolidate, to rule, to administer. And Alexander wasn't into those really important duties of a king.
And that which brings us to our next topic.
Okay.
If I'm not mistaken, the Macedonian Empire went from Greece, Macedonia, to almost India.
That's right, yeah. I mean, the Greeks called it India, but actually Alexander was operating in what today would be Pakistan. Pakistan was only created in 1947 when India was partitioned. So, if you have an ancient source that says Alexander was campaigning in Pakistan, then that source is probably false. But it's a made-up one. But no, so he went as far as the Punjabi region, He probably wanted to go to the Ganges, but his men mutinied on him. But this was an extraordinary empire when you think about it. It ran from Greece in the west all the way to what is today Pakistan in the east. It included Syria, the Levantine coast. It included Egypt. I mean, this was an extraordinary achievement by one man in less than 10 years. I make the analogy with the Roman Empire, which was much larger. Sure, it was enormous, or the British Empire, which was also enormous. But these were the product of decades. In the case of Rome, the product of centuries and of numerous generals and emperors. So for one man to lead an army from Greece to Pakistan and call that his empire in less than 10 years really does make Alexander without parallel in the ancient world, or indeed in world history.
The whole idea about this podcast episode is because of my cousin who loves Alexander, and I thought I have to do something to him because he always supported me, and I think he'll be very happy of listening how Alexander was great.
Yeah.
And talking a little bit about the wars that Alexander fought, or the battles, he defeated the Persian Empire. He defeated Darius, if I'm not mistaken, was the leader of the Persians.
Mm-hmm.
He conquered the Near Asia, if we can say so. But can we say that the military strategy that Alexander adopted was his strategy or Philip's strategy?
It was probably he would have learned from his father. There's no that, but he developed his strategy as he marched further eastward, and this is not a surprise because no Macedonian king had ever invaded Persia before, and so Philip's strategy presumably would have been quite different had he invaded Persia, had he lived. Had to fight the Persians in battle. So Alexander was certainly following his father's strategy and tactics when it came to forming his line, the way he used the ground, that's topography and terrain. But Alexander became an expert in psychological warfare, in demoralizing the enemy. And Philip had done this to an extent, but it was Alexander that took it to a whole new level. And that was how he was able to defeat these huge Persian armies, because often they were 3-4 times bigger than his own army. And you would think, well, come on, when you've got Alexander's army at, say, 40,000 men, and Darius has an army of, say, 150,000 men, if you were a betting man, you would put your money on Darius. And how did Alexander defeat this? And what he did was psychological warfare, and that is to take out Darius. Instead of trying to attack the enemy frontally, head on with his entire line, and then just have sort of down and dirty street fighting, Alexander's strategy was focused on him and his companion cavalry galloping towards Darius, the idea being to try and kill him or capture him, and that, once you've chopped off the head, then the rest of the men would become so demoralized that they would lose the will to fight and they would flee. And that is exactly what happened at the big battles such as Issus and Gaugamela, where Darius fled. He left the scene of battle. The Persians were demoralized, and Alexander's men were able to be victorious. It's very similar if you go back a century or so to the era of the Persian Wars in Greece, and that after a significant battle there, the Battle of Salamis, the great king of Persia, Xerxes, actually left Greece. He fled back to Persia, and he left his army behind. and his commanders just couldn't rally the men, and that was why the Greeks were able to defeat the Persians in the Persian War. So Alexander knew his Greek history. He knew that he saw the vulnerability of the Persian army once it lost its leadership, and that was the basis of his strategy. That's how he was so successful. And it's absolutely brilliant. And you see that today in modern warfare, where you take out an enemy's communications or ammunitions dump, or senior military personnel. And without those sorts of essential items, then resistance becomes very difficult.
So he was a military genius, you can say that.
I think so, yeah. In that respect, there's no question whatsoever that he deserves to be called great, because he really, he was always putting himself at the front of the fighting. He wasn't like Napoleon, who said, okay, well, the battle is here, but I'm going to be standing 2 miles away. He was always in the thick of fighting. He was always leading his men on. He was a superb leader of men, a brilliant tactician. So there's no question about it that he really is one of history's greatest generals.
I think he remembers me a little bit of Leonidas fighting the Persians in Thermopylae, like fighting with your men in the front line with a much greater army.
That's right, yeah.
And Alexander went on rampage for 10 years, conquering what was the world back then for him, I believe. I don't know if they knew much of how the world was. I don't believe they knew that like China existed. I probably can be wrong.
I think that's right. The Greeks knew about the Persians and had known about them for a very long time. You have the Persian Wars, for example. You had people, ancients, writing about Persia. Herodotus wrote about Persian history and Persian culture. There were some trading contacts with Persia, and it's the same with Egypt too. There are trading contacts with Egypt. So really, around the Mediterranean area, the Greeks knew about the people who lived there from direct contact with them. The further east that Alexander marched, it was starting to become a different story. We know that the further east he marched, he had to start using interpreters, and he was coming across really different customs from what the Greeks were used to. This really was a new area for them. It was make no mistake, Alexander invaded Asia. He went to conquer. He went to do battle and kill people and overcome them. But at the same invasion had the byproducts of sending information about these new areas back to Greece. It was also, if you like, a voyage of exploration, and it also spread Greek culture in the East. So these are byproducts of it, and you could argue, of course, on moral grounds, does that justify the means? Do you invade a country, impose your own civilization on it, but you generate knowledge about that country? Is that the most important thing? But yes, certainly the further east that Alexander marched, the less that his men and the Greeks knew about these areas. He really opened up a whole new world, so to speak.
Alexander decided, because of Philip influence, to march to Pakistan, to today Pakistan. Why didn't he march north, for example, into Europe?
I don't think it was not as lucrative, for one thing. Once you move north of the Balkans or so, you're in an area where there are more tribes that are living there. You see this under the Romans, for example. You think of Julius Caesar and his invasion of Gaul, what is today places like Belgium, France, Germany, etc., etc. And the battles he faced with tribes and what have you, and different peoples. And it wasn't very lucrative. There wasn't a lot of booty to get, and it wasn't all that valuable. The Persians were loaded. I mean, their wealth was famous. And so this represented for Alexander the chance to acquire enormous amounts of treasure by invading Persia. And that's what he did. I mean, he became the richest man in the world. I mean, never mind about Elon Musk or you know, Warren Buffett or Bill Gates. I mean, Alexander would have had more liquid capital, more money than all of the 1% in the world put together right now. And there was also the fact that it was his father who had laid the plans to invade Persia. Philip never intended to invade north because he knew the obstacles he faced. But by invading Persia, this was the chance to win military glory. And so therefore, because Philip had laid the plans to invade Persia, Alexander had to follow them. He had to do what Dad did, but do it better.
That makes sense. As you said earlier, Philip's ghost haunted
Yes.
Alexander.
Yeah, I think that's right. But as I said, it's definitely the booty, the treasure. The Persians were fabulously wealthy, and in the great palaces that Alexander took, places like Babylon and Susa and Persepolis, the amount of bullion, treasure that he found is just hard to imagine. It really is. There was a lot of it.
If I'm not mistaken, Armageddon sings, "Entre Babylon and Susa, treasure he found."
Yes.
So,
yeah,
and I believe that during his years of battle, he had one or more spouses. I don't think he got married, but I believe he had lovers all over Asia.
Right. He did get married. But this was in Bactria, what is today northern Afghanistan, and he married. This was in 327 BC, so he had been king for almost 10 years, and he married a Bactrian lady, a very famous name, Roxanne, and Roxanne became his wife. She eventually gave birth to a boy. The boy was born after Alexander the Great died, but that little boy was Alexander the Fourth, and he didn't last for very long. But poor Roxanne, to me, Roxanne is one of the tragic figures, the tragic women of the period. There are a lot of power women in Macedonian history. A lot of what you would say kick-ass females. Roxanne, unfortunately, isn't one of them. She was used by her father. Alexander married her just so that he could win the support of her father. He, at the time, was living with another woman, and Roxanne had to see him visiting her every so often. This other woman was also pregnant with his child, though because Alexander was not married to her, she was called Martini, then that child was illegitimate, so it would never inherit the throne. But Roxanne had to put up with that. And then she is transported back to Greece when Alexander dies. And eventually, one of the successors of Alexander imprisons her and the baby son at Amphipolis in northern Greece. And then in 310, they are executed. So Roxanne has just got an awful life. There's not a lot of information on her, but you just wish that there were, because I would love to write a book about her, but there's just not enough. But if I were making a movie about her, she would definitely be a tragic figure. You just feel so sorry for the way that she was used and abused.
You said that the marriage was a political marriage. I believe I can say that.
It was a political marriage, but it was interesting because it did not go down well with Alexander's men, and that was because of Roxanne's ethnicity. She was Bactrian. She was an Afghan, shall we say, and so that that interracial marriage is very unusual, but also the men knew that from that point onwards, there would never be a full-blood Macedonian heir. That if Alexander had married a nice Macedonian girl, they would have had, a Macedonian child. There would be no problems with the succession in the future. But this interracial marriage in this period, I mean, nowadays we don't think twice about it, nor should we. But back then it was a big deal. And the men did not react very favorably to this.
That's interesting. I never heard of like racism. If I can, I think it's racist.
There's a lot of it. There's a lot of it. I mean, there's probably. I mean, if you went back in a time machine and said to the Greeks and used the term racist to the Greeks, they would have said, "I don't know what you're talking about. That term wasn't there." But when, for example, the Greeks south of Mount Olympus refer to the Macedonians as barbarians, that's not complimentary. I mean, if you go into a pub and say to someone you're a barbarian, you're probably not going to get out of there alive.
Probably not.
But there was an awful. I mean, the Macedonians resented the fact that Alexander was bringing foreigners. That's Iranians, Afghans, what today would be Turks. That's people, from Asia Minor. They resented him bringing in all these different nationalities into the army and into his administration. They didn't like it. And the marriage to Roxanne did not go down at all well either. And one of the reasons why the men mutinied the second time on Alexander was because he was bringing so many foreign soldiers into the army and replacing Macedonians. So, as I said, you go back in a time machine and use the word racist, they wouldn't know what you were talking about. But when you're looking at their actions and their attitudes to non-Greek peoples, it's all xenophobia and it's all racist.
And I think it's interesting because they are fighting a war. And if you think that Macedonia, it's much smaller than the Persian Empire, for example. He wouldn't get manpower enough or enough manpower from Macedonia. He would need the Persians, for example. So I think I can say that, like, the Persians, the people the Persians conquered before were actually manpower for Alexander. Alexander needed them to refill the front lines.
Yeah. I mean, today, for example, you see, if you think of a modern army, people from different nationalities and backgrounds are all mixed up in the ranks. They're all, they're all part of the same regiment. But back in the Macedonian army, even in the days of Philip, when Philip conquered Thrace, for example, what would very loosely be the Balkans, Bulgaria today, he always kept, and Alexander the same, always kept different nationalities, to use that term, in different ethnic units of the army. So they were never mixed together with the Macedonians. And again, this is an example of clearly keeping different peoples apart.
And were they treated equally, or for example? I thought not.
They were treated equally in the sense that you're going to fight the enemy, and if you die, well, you die. But they received the same amount of pay. But in terms of it's the attitude, you see, it's that's it. That's the key here. So there's no equal treatment there. The Macedonians looked down on these other people because they thought they were superior as a race, as a people.
If, for example, Persian that was fighting for Alexander, for example, if he was a great warrior, would he get like rank up or still be in the bottom of the hierarchy?
No, it would depend on who the person was, but more often than not, the answer is no, and that when Alexander did use Persians in his administration, they were never given real power. They were just like figureheads, whereas the army in a satrapy, for example, and the financial resources of a satrapy were always in the hands of Macedonians. So there's a clear order here between the people who have the actual power and the ones who might have the name, the title, but they don't have any power. They don't control the money. They don't control the army.
Makes sense. It's like I'm keeping the enemy closer to me, but they don't have any power. I just want to. I think I can say he wants just to understand more of the Persians, like know your enemy.
Right. He never really got to know them more, and that's why there were so many problems. The same with the Bactrians and Indians in Central Asia. He never really. Maybe he didn't even care, but he didn't really learn about their culture. He didn't learn about their customs. If something was alien to the Greeks and they didn't like it, he tried to ban it. And this is not working with different people. I mean, we today, for example, some customs in countries we find really difficult. I think in China, there's still that custom of binding feet to make them small. Yes. But of course, that leads to deformity. In Bactria, Central Asia, the Bactrians had a custom that when their people got very old or were really sick, they put them outside their city walls to be eaten by dogs. And this isn't very nice. I mean, this I think, is a plot for a Quentin Tarantino movie.
Yes.
But the thing is, it's abhorrent, and we would condemn it, but it was their custom. And Alexander didn't sit down and say, okay, let's try to talk about why this is bad. He simply banned it because it was alien to the Greeks. And as a result, the people, of course, reacted against him. And so, as I said, we hear today of all different customs in different countries, some of which we might not agree with, but we also have to recognize, even though it's unsavory, we have to recognize that it's their custom. And so we need to try and establish some sort of communication, try to establish a compromise rather than just unilaterally say, this is wrong because we say so. And that's the problem when you have the West interfering in the...
Alexander became famous for many things, but one thing that makes him making a lot famous is the Alexander Library, who was burned down in Egypt. Did he invested in culture only in Egypt or in all his empire during the wars in Persia, Pakistan, Afghanistan? Because we only heard like Alexandria in Egypt, the library. We don't talk much about the cities that he founded in Persia, for example.
He did found a lot of cities. Alexandria is the big one because everyone's heard of it. But a lot of, in terms of cities, he probably founded about half a dozen, and then throughout the empire, then the rest were more military outposts. They're more like military garrisons. And they were really there for security reasons anyway. But Alexandria is an interesting case because there wasn't a library or museum under Alexander. That was all Ptolemy. And it's very likely that when Alexander the Great founded Alexandria, he had no intention of making it into a great city. He probably just intended it as a port in the north of Egypt on the Mediterranean, which would be an excellent base for a fleet. And it's only, so yeah, I mean, you don't hear of him talking about a palace there. So he never intended to live there. You don't hear him talking about all sorts of things that you would identify with the great city that Alexandria became. And after Alexander died and his empire was carved up by his generals and what have you, Ptolemy, one of his royal bodyguard, took over Egypt. And it was Ptolemy who founded the Ptolemaic dynasty, which was that very long dynasty, which ended with the famous Cleopatra in 30 BC when Rome conquered Egypt. And it's Ptolemy who decides that he's going to make Alexandria the place to be. He's going to make it the Rio de Janeiro of Egypt. And those of you who are listening to this in Sao Paulo, my apologies for that, but I've not been to Sao Paulo yet. I'd like to. Now, and so it's Ptolemy who starts the construction of the palace. It's Ptolemy who starts the construction of the museum and the library, who also builds a mausoleum for Alexander's body. So it's Ptolemy who decides, you know what? Alexandria is going to be the new capital of Egypt. So all the cultural greatness of Alexandria in the Hellenistic period as a center for literature, for science, for mathematics, that's all because of Ptolemy, nothing to do with Alexander the Great.
That's interesting, because we hear Alexandria, the city of Alexander the Great, but the city was made great not by Alexander. That's funny.
What Ptolemy was doing, of course, was exploiting the name of Alexander. It was to give him some sort of legitimacy to his rule of Egypt. I'm a successor of Alexander. So after Alexander died, his generals did exploit his name for their own political ends. But that was as far as it went. In terms of the great cities, for example, in the east that the Seleucids founded, like Antioch, and later on Pergamum, which was a great center for art in the Hellenistic period. These have got nothing to do with Alexander. These are all due to the rulers that followed him, but they're exploiting his name. So there's the difference.
It's true that Alexander named one city after his horse.
Okay. You took me by surprise, because we've just gone from Alexandria to his horse. This was in what the Greeks called India. It was after the Battle of the Hydaspes River against an Indian prince by the name of Porus. I think this is one of Alexander's greatest battles ever. But he was victorious. But in the battle, his horse, called Bucephalus, was fatally wounded and died shortly after. And Alexander had this horse since he was a child. There is the famous story that this horse was brought to Pella, the Macedonian capital, and it was a large black horse, and nobody could ride it. It would, every time anybody approached it, it would rear up and it would whinny. I won't do a horse impression, but it would neigh and whinny, and it would kick people, whatever horses do, hoof them or something. And apparently Alexander, who was only about 8 or 9, this is a story, it might be completely untrue, but it's put out as part of the Alexander legend, the Alexander myth. But the story goes that Alexander saw that the horse was startled by its own shadow, that when it looked on the ground and saw its shadow, it jumped away from it. So Alexander supposedly turned the horse around to face the sun. The shadow fell behind it, so it couldn't see its own shadow. Then Alexander jumped on the horse and was able to ride it. And that horse was Bucephalus. So he had Bucephalus with him a hell of a long time, throughout just pretty much his entire reign. And when it died of wounds in that battle at the Hydaspes River, he founded 2 cities there, actually. One was called Nicaea, which you might translate as Victory City. That was probably on the side of the actual battleground, the victory. Another one on the other side of the Hydaspes River was called Bucephala, and that was in honor of Bucephalus, his horse. But as I said, trying to get to the historical Alexander is really difficult. Bucephalus is an example of this, because if you go back to that story of turning the horse away so it doesn't see its own shadow, you have to think, well, all of this is done in front of Philip and his companion cavalry, as well as the horse trader, the person who was selling the horse. Wouldn't you think that those guys would have seen that the horse was startled by its shadow? So this is what I mean. We know Alexander had a horse. We know it was called Bucephalus. We know it died in the Battle of the Hydaspes River. But here's a chance, therefore, for Alexander to promote his own legend by saying, look, at such an early age, I was able to see this and nobody else could. That's a very long answer to your question. Did he found a city after a horse?
It's a long but excellent answer, because I never heard of the shadow history, and I think like, I'm a almost historian, and I think it's a lie, because as I said, doesn't make any sense. But it's a way for Alexander to promote himself, what would make sense. And talking a little bit again about his conquer, or his conquer of Asia, Turkey, Pakistan, Afghanistan. You said he built 6 cities and some outposts. For me, don't seem like he was planning long term. He was thinking, I will conquer this, and this. Later, I find out what I will do with that. Can I assume that like he wasn't planning a lot?
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. He does seem to have been different from his father in the sense that Alexander thought that if you defeat someone in battle, you've conquered them. And that's not the case. You defeat someone in battle, you then have to impose your rule. You then have to take care of administration. You have to reconcile the natives to your rule. Excuse me. And Alexander never did that. He was always anxious to move on to the next battle. And even in India, after that battle, when he was forced to turn back, he was already planning his next campaign. His next campaign was going to be to Arabia. And probably after that, he was going to go to the Western Mediterranean and perhaps make war on Carthage, which was the biggest power, naval power in the Western Mediterranean at that time. So and as he marched westwards, as he left India behind, as he left Bactria behind, all these places revolted from him. And so you can, at the end of it, there was no formal exit plan. There was no attempt to try to consolidate and maintain rule. It was a case of, okay, let's head west now. Where can I go next? Okay, let's do Arabia. And then let's go to the Western Mediterranean. And of course, as he tracks, westwards, the places revolt as soon as he leaves. So the question, of course, is at the end of the day, what did he gain?
Nothing.
Yeah.
Maybe some honor and fame, but he didn't conquer anything.
Honor and fame, but at what cost, though? I mean, we're talking about genocide once we move into Central Asia. In some instances, entire peoples are wiped out. In one, Alexander's faced by a guerrilla leader in Bactria called Spitamenes, and Spitamenes is given shelter by the inhabitants of a valley in Bactria. And when Alexander finds this out, he gives orders to slaughter the entire valley, and over 100,000 people are put to death. And that's just one instance. So as Alexander's march progresses eastwards, it gets bloodier and bloodier. It gets far more far more brutal. The atrocities increase. So you're talking about genocide. You're talking about war crimes. And to be honest, if Alexander were alive and you put him on trial today, you could do so for war crimes and he would be found guilty, because he's not just killing military populations. He's not just attacking armies. He's now wiping out innocent civilians in their own homes, in their own towns. Sounds a lot like Russia and Ukraine, eh?
Unfortunately, yes.
And the European community coming together to condemn, well, not just Europe, but to condemn Putin and say he should be put on trial for war crimes. History doesn't change, unfortunately.
We hope that we would learn for the past, but that doesn't happen.
Right.
And it's interesting because when he was doing that, killing thousands of innocent people, he wasn't helping the people to trust him, to obey him, to obey the Macedon. He was
Absolutely.
throwing fuel into the fire.
That's the worst thing you can do, is you don't give people what's called an out. You don't give them a chance. If people resist you and they know that it doesn't matter if they win or lose, they're going to be killed, then they're going to fight to the death. And they're going to try to take out as many of the invaders as they can along the way. And that is not good leadership.
And one thing that made Alexander famous, and there are made any scenes about it too, is the famous Gordian knot. That who wouldn't tie the knot would become the master of Asia. Alexander cut the knot off, just cut it off. That really happened, or just another legend about Alexander?
No, it really happened. But again, you've got the legendary status. This was in the summer of 333. It was before the first battle against Darius. It was for the major battle of Issus. And Alexander actually detoured to Gordium in Phrygia. He knew that Darius was on the move, and this is what I mean by psychological warfare. He knew that Darius was on the move, that Darius was marching to meet him. And so you would think that any other commander would march his men to meet Darius and do battle with him. Instead, Alexander deviates. He detours up to Gordium so that he can undo that Gordian knot, because the prophecy is, as you said, the prophecy is whoever undoes it will rule Asia. So Alexander has to undo it. And can you imagine the psychological effect on the Persians? Because this knot's been there for 200, 300, 400 years or whatever. It's been there, forever. And suddenly this guy Alexander comes along and undoes it. I mean, he slashes it with his sword and says, well, I undid it, guys. And as I said, this psychological effect of this person undoing the Gordian knot. So therefore, he's going to be the next ruler of Asia. So the Persians that met Alexander that day in battle would already have been freaked out at this. So this again is something Alexander's very clever at, and that's the psychological strategy.
And yes, I mean, you're a Persian, and you heard that this foreign guy that you already fear just became the king of Asia. I wouldn't want to fight him, for example. I just say
that's right.
Psychological effort.
Yeah.
And as we already talked a little bit about it, but I want to talk a little bit more. That Alexander died of fever, if I'm not mistaken, at his 30s, if I'm not wrong.
Probably, or alcoholic poisoning, something like that. Sometimes people just die. But if you happen to be a superhuman figure in history, again, there has to be a conspiracy theory. And so there is a theory that Alexander was poisoned, but that I think is wrong. It doesn't make sense, and nobody really stood to gain anything. So most likely is that here is Alexander, who's had a very punishing lifestyle. In India, he was taking part in a siege, and he was almost killed. He had a near fatal. He probably from the way the sources describe it, he had a punctured lung, because our sources talk about how an arrow was pulled out from his chest, and when it was pulled out by his doctor, there was a hiss of air and blood, and that seems to be consistent with a punctured lung. He also had numerous other battle wounds, and the point I'm getting at here is that today, if you suffer a serious wound, you usually have a lifestyle change. You know, your doctor might say, okay, I want you to start exercising, or you can't eat meat anymore, or God forbid you can't drink alcohol anymore. Or you've got to start eating salads, which only rabbits do. And so you've got, you have a sort of lifestyle change because your body has suffered a traumatic occurrence. Alexander's body suffered many traumatic occurrences over his reign, but he didn't change his lifestyle. He carried on partying. And when we're talking about partying, our sources tell us that sometimes he would sleep for 2 days and 2 nights after a drinking party. I mean, that's serious drinking there. I mean, it makes Slash and Charlie Sheen look like teetotalers. And so he would party really hard, and I think eventually it just all caught up to him. And so it was at a drinking party where he supposedly downed an enormous amount of wine, and he collapsed. And then about a week to 10 days later, he died. And so usually, well, not usually, maybe the most common explanation now for his death is acute alcoholic pancreatitis.
So,
but that seems to be consistent with also with his last moments as well. The inability to talk, the semi-comatose state, all these sorts of things that our sources describe, and so that's likely too. Another thing also is grief syndrome, which I don't think should be downplayed. One of Alexander's closest friends, and indeed one of his lovers, was a man named Hephaestion. The two of them had known each other since childhood. He was Alexander's closest friend, Alexander's confidant. And Hephaestion died in 324. And Alexander was just devastated. I mean, suddenly there was this massive hole in his life. And he must have felt very lonely then. Here he was at the top of his game, but there was no one with him as such. He had nobody to talk to anymore, nobody to depend on. And nowadays, grief syndrome is recognized as a condition. You sometimes hear about couples who have been married for 50 or 60 years. One dies, and the other one dies only a few hours or a few days later. And this also, I mean, Hephaestion died a year before Alexander did. So grief syndrome might also have had an effect on Alexander. And so all this sort of thing, his wounds, his lifestyle, grief syndrome, all came together in a sort of perfect storm that led to his death. So that's what I mean when I say that sometimes people just die. There's no conspiracy theory there. Alexander the Great just died a victim of his own success.
And I was thinking here, he was born to fight. He fight. Probably the alcohol was an escape, maybe, from his fighting routine. It was a moment to relax, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, the Macedonians did enjoy to party. That's for sure, and it was a form of relaxation. But at the end of the day, if you'd offered Alexander a future of drinking parties or fighting, he would always have chosen the fighting. And again, he had to because his father was a warrior. Philip suffered some terrible wounds. I mean, he lost a right eye in a siege. He was shot through his right eye by an arrow. He was very badly wounded in a leg and limped for the rest of his life. And in those days, wounds were a sign of masculinity as well. It was macho to be wounded. And so Alexander also had to get into fights and had to be wounded, because this was what was expected of a warrior king. And because his father had, there was more of Philip missing than intact. Because his father was wounded, Alexander got wounded as well. So he would always have put fighting over anything else when it came to his life.
Only to try to be better than his father.
To be better than his father, and also to be like his Homeric heroes. I said at the beginning of our talk that Homer was his favorite author. He apparently slept with a copy of the Iliad under his pillow, and he wanted to be another Achilles. Achilles was one of his ancestors anyway, and he modeled himself on Achilles. And heroic warriors, the warriors like Achilles, Ajax, etc. These weren't people who played computer games. They got in there and they fought each other, because that was what a hero did. That was what you were supposed to do. And Alexander wanted to be a 4th century Achilles. So that's another reason also why he lived this Homeric lifestyle, because this is what Homeric warriors did. They had downtime where they drank and played dice, but for them, most of their lives were consumed in fighting, and fighting for a noble cause, and and having integrity. And that's what Alexander was trying to do. So, I mean, you almost feel sorry for him, because it's as if he's got no choice but to do what he does, because of the actions of Achilles and the actions of Philip. Alexander doesn't have a choice to be his own man in many respects.
And as we have been talking, he was a great warrior, committed murders, but was a great warrior. And he defeated his enemies, but didn't conquer them. What happened to Alexander's empire after his death?
Well, it came to an end. It disintegrated because I mentioned that Alexander had married Roxanne, but that was just too late. When Alexander first came to power in 336, he got married, and he should have had a son to continue the dynasty. I mean, this was one of the jobs of a king, is you have to get married, you have to produce an heir. Even if you don't like the woman, marry her, produce an heir. And he didn't do that, so he failed as a king there. And by the time he married Roxanne, it was too late. And if he'd lived for another 10, 20 years, it would have been fine. But when he died in 323, Roxanne was still pregnant with their child. It would be that little boy would be born about 3 or 4 months after Alexander died. So there was no heir to succeed Alexander properly. And so his generals, a senior staff, got together in Babylon, which is where Alexander died. And they decided they were going to carve up the empire between themselves. So I mentioned Ptolemy before, but Ptolemy, who was one of the royal bodyguard, took Egypt. Somebody else took Thrace, somebody else Asia Minor, another person Greece and Macedonia. And so the single Macedonian empire came to an end, and there would never be an empire again. And eventually, of course, the people who took power over those areas would kill the baby boy, Alexander IV, and then they're not going to bow down to a kid and have him ruling when they are now rulers of their own kingdoms. Eventually, they call themselves kings. They establish their own dynasties, and this is the Hellenistic period that we have. These are the great dynasties of the Hellenistic era, like Ptolemaic Egypt, Seleucid Syria, and Antigonid Macedonia.
Can we say that Alexander, even dying in his 30s, he changed the world, or at least the world he lived in?
He did. I mean, I was once asked what was Alexander or Philip's greatest legacy, and I said probably the fact that 2,500 years later we're still talking about them. And you're right, Alexander did change the world in the sense that he opened up the East to the West like never before. He made the Greeks of the Mediterranean area. He made them feel part of a much larger world than just the Mediterranean. And in the centuries after his death, you see trade and commerce. You see people moving around. You see a lot of interaction. You see a lot of cultural exchanges between West and East that we're kind of used to today. And you could argue that it all started off with Alexander. So yeah, he changed certainly the Mediterranean and the Near East, no question about that. But you ask yourselves at the end of the day, at what cost though? And by that I mean, when you're looking at Alexander, would you call him a successful king? People might say, well, of course he was. You know, he had this big army and he beat the Persians in all these battles, and oh, Alexandria, and oh, he had a horse, and blah, blah, blah. You know, it all goes on. But at the end of the day, he was a failure as a king. The fact that once Alexander invaded Asia in 334, that's 2 years after he came to power, he never returned to Macedonia. He ignored his own people. So he was never a king in Macedonia. He risked the lives of his men in numerous battles, often fought just for his own military glory. When he died, he hadn't given thought to an heir. And as I said, that's one of the jobs of a ruler, whether it's king or queen, is to have an heir and continue that dynasty. And so as a result, when he died, Macedonia collapsed into chaos. His empire was brought to an end. These are not the sorts of things that you would describe as successful for a king, and something worthy of being called the Great.
You just answered the final question that I would ask.
Well, you see, well, the final question on, was he actually great? It depends how you define great. You know, one thing, first of all, if he's great, he must have done something spectacular, right? I mean, if you talk about someone who's great today, you know, if they join the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame or the Basketball Hall of Fame, then they must be really good. So Alexander, therefore, must be really good. But as I said, you could call him great as far as his strategy goes, as far as his generalship goes. But can you really call him great as a king? And the answer is no, because when you move away from his generalship, he was flawed. He thought he was a god while he was alive. He was a megalomaniac. He was paranoid. He would have people who were close to him murdered if he grew suspicious of them. He didn't have an heir to prolong the dynasty, and the empire collapsed on his death. So he's not great in that respect. The other thing also is when you look at the number of kings with the name Alexander, there were 4 of them. And perhaps he's called great just to make him different from the other 3 Alexanders who were okay, but didn't do anything spectacular. So, you know, that might just be a way of saying, well, when you've got multiple kings with the same name and one of them does something exceptional, you might want to try and you know, shine a spotlight on that person. That's why you might call him great, because you think about Julius Caesar. He was a great conqueror. He established, you know, Roman rule in Gaul, etc. He invaded England, and yet he's not called great. But how many Julius Caesars are there in Roman history? You know, who were dictators and who were murdered. You see, so there's no need to call him great in that respect.
So maybe we can say Alexander the Great General, but not the great king or the great
So, and
leader.
that's, if he was just a general, I'd have no problem calling him great. I mean, you think of Pompey, for example, in the Roman Republic. Pompey is called great, but that's because of his generalship abilities. If Philip had continued living as king of Macedonia and sent Alexander off to Persia to invade it as his general, then I'd have no problem calling Alexander great. You see, Alexander wasn't just a general, he was the king of Macedonia. So you have to factor everything else in, as a diplomat, as a leader of his kingdom, and as a man. And there you find out that he's deeply flawed.
Before we end, do you have any final words? Any how can I say? Any final words? Any reading tips for who is listening to us?
Oh, well, obviously you've got to read my books because they're just brilliant. So that's my tip for you. Look me up on the web, buy any of the books, and for a fee, I'll sign it. Only the other thing is you've got to invite me back to Brazil as soon as travel is allowed again, because I really enjoyed that place. But I think next time I'll bring my wife as well.
When you come back, I hope I'll still be here. I plan to travel, so you'll be very welcome, and I hope we meet in FMG and maybe share a caipirinha together.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you very much, Professor, for your time. It was a brilliant talk. It was a brilliant class. I learned a lot today, and I'm sure that everyone who's listening to us have learned as well.
One thing I will say is that I really enjoy getting emails from people with questions or with feedback. So if anybody is listening that wants to ask a question or just to say hello from Brazil, please, you can find my email on the web, or maybe you can post it in this podcast. But please feel free to drop me a line and say hello. That would be fun.
Or maybe to invite you to another podcast.
Yeah, sure, absolutely, anytime.
Thank you very much, Professor.
We can talk about something uncontroversial like why Bolsonaro is an excellent leader.
Or we can talk about how Bolsonaro has to get out of power really quickly.
I shall resign.
I was being sarcastic.
Of course. Thank you very much, Professor, for your time, for your class. And I hope to see you again.
Bye.
I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow.